Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
How do national parks develop their interpretive materials? What influences come into play when a park begins to outline its approach and the direction it takes when crafting educational materials for visitors? Is the National Park Service careful to take a truthful path when presenting history? This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler, and those are topical questions considering the Trump administration's efforts to rid the national park system of interpretive materials that disparage Americans or which it objects to. But political influences on park messaging are not unique to the Trump administration. Robert Pahre is a political science professor at the University of Illinois, and he has been studying the effect of politics on national park interpretation in the past. He joins us to discuss what he's found in that research and to weigh in on what's going on today in terms of political pressures on the National Park Service. I'll be back with Professor Pahre after a short break.
Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome to the Traveler, Bob.
Thank you, Kurt. It's good to be here on the Traveler with you.
I understand you've been writing a book on politics of national park interpretation. What made you want to write that book?
This was accidental. So it started out thinking about transboundary issues of wildlife management, like outside Glacier National Park or outside Yellowstone, and then just discovering that the more of those places I looked at, the more important tribal governments were in a lot of those large landscapes. And then that started me down some cultural studies, and I ended up thinking about how some of those stories that Indigenous people tell differ from what the parks are telling. And once I went down that rabbit hole, I never got back out. So it's the politics behind how the parks are telling stories, and Indigenous people are one part of that, but not the whole story at all.
Oh, well, I was going to ask you, who's right?
About which?
Wildlife management, for instance, forest health, for instance. We have the Park Service approach, and we got tribal nations approaches.
Yeah, it was one of the interesting questions about the management as well as the interpretation is sacred sites writ large and sacred species, and Indigenous people are just going to think differently about a spiritually significant animal like the swift fox outside Glacier than the Park Service or the Forest Service will think of them. And so too sacred spaces. So some of those sacred spaces are known. You're in Utah, and so you can probably think of some. And some of those sacred spaces are not known, and in fact, there's only insiders are allowed to know them. So it's hard to tell the parks to protect something if you can't tell them what they should be protecting?
That's interesting. Some years ago, I wrote a book, as you probably know, about bison and bison in the West and how to put bison back onto the landscape. And I talked to a professor at, I can't remember if it was Yale or Harvard, and he had some Indian blood in him. His father, I think, was a full blooded Native American. And there's this perception at the time that indigenous cultures were better stewards, better husbands of wildlife husbandry. And he said that's not exactly true. He said, they killed as many as they needed if they were hungry. If they weren't hungry, they didn't kill that many. So I'm not sure if that contradicts what you were just saying about, how they view wildlife versus how white cultures view wildlife.
Well, bison have spiritual significance for many
Absolutely.
nations,
Sure.
and they ate them, right? And so, that's part of what's going on. That's one reason why I mentioned kit foxes, because nobody's eating kit foxes.
Nobody's eating kit foxes.
But again, if you're a biologist, you think about kit foxes being important in an ecosystem. And if you're Blackfeet, you may see them as being significant in a spiritual system of some kind. And so
Yeah.
you're just going to approach the problem in somewhat different ways. They may
Sure.
be compatible ways or not.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, I went to Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, and Cape Breton National Park, beautiful place. Fell in love with it. I keep trying to tell my wife we need to move to Nova Scotia. She's not so on board with it as I am. But what I really found fascinating in their parks is they have Native American interpretation placards up.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was fascinating to be able to get that cultural interpretation, which I do think is lacking from American national parks.
I would say it is often lacking in American national parks. Some parks consult better than others and get some of those stories in. So if you go to Canyon Visitor Center in Yellowstone, for example, the second floor actually has it looks into the first floor. And so there's 4 walls or railings around this open space. And there are 4 separate affiliated nations that helped with the interpretation in this particular space. So the Kiowa are telling the story of Dragon's Mouth
Mm-hmm.
and so on. So the Park Service just brought them in there. I think of it as the new exhibit in Mather, just because I started the book while they still had the old one in place, but it's not that new anymore. It brings in a little bit there. There are some indigenous first parks, like Sand Creek Massacre, where the establishment legislation actually provides for the Arapaho and Cheyenne to have a privileged position in the interpretation. And
Mm-hmm.
that includes, for example, vetoing books, which, nobody likes to do. So there are places like that here in the Midwest. The Grand Portage National Monument is on the reservation, the Grand Portage Band of Chippewa. And that band actually were the first advocates for that park, along with the Minnesota Historical Society. So they've always had a partnership there. They have complaints, but they also have, a voice and an ear about how that story gets told. So, yeah, I like to say that there's good news out there, and then there are places that are less good news.
Yeah, I don't know if you've been to Hawaii volcanoes, but they are really doing wonderful work in terms of taking the park map that they pass out to visitors that includes the Native Hawaiian names for different places, which I think is a good step in the right direction.
Yeah, there's the northernmost battlefield of the Trail of Nez Perce National Historical Park, and I'm drawing a blank on that, right by the Canadian border. That has its own brochure, and it has welcomes in Nimipu, the Nez Perce language. And I have that brochure actually on this desk somewhere, although I'm not going to rummage around and find it.
No need to. This is voice only.
Uh, and so that's happening. Again, there are places that just consult more, and there's places that need to consult a lot more than they do. I'll
Yeah, yeah.
say it like
Well,
that. So
we'll probably get into this a little bit later in our conversation, but there might be fewer places doing it than we'd like. Now, your focus has been in 50 park units between the Mississippi River and the foothills of the Rockies. Some folks derisively refer to that place as flyover America. Why did you choose that area?
well, the selfish personal reason is because I live on one end of that in Illinois, and I like to vacation in the Rockies, and so I drive across there. So it's drive-through country, not flyover country. But a more serious intellectual reason is that everybody studies Yosemite and Yellowstone, which I do too, and the other crown jewel parks. It's not hard to find a history of Glacier or Mount Rainier or Denali or Grand Canyon or a bunch of other parks that would come to the Smokies that would come to people's mind immediately. People don't write histories about those 50 parks in the heart of the country. It's less than an eighth of the system, but it's a big chunk of the system.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it includes the National Historical Trails, which are mythic parts of American history. Um, and it includes, people also like to write books about the Civil War and the Civil War parks. And of course, we're having a debate about the Civil War and slavery again right now. My study area does include Civil War battlefields, one in Missouri, one in Arkansas, one in New Mexico.
Yeah, yeah,
It includes a battlefield of the Mexican-American War, um, which people don't think about. So it's just getting at some stories that get left out. And some of those, like the National Historical Trails, are mythic stories, right? Scott's Bluff,
yeah. Great history there.
right? And so it's just nice. I decided I was just going to do it.
And what are you finding over the years?
Uh, so the way I organize the book conceptually and the chapters that I've actually written, which is nice, is I think in terms of two different parts of what interpretation is. Some of it is commemoration. So you go to Washington, D.C., you see the Washington Monument. It is commemorating George Washington. There are exhibits at the base of the monument, but there haven't always been exhibits at the base of the monument. It is pure commemoration. It's this big marble thing that commemorates the first president. And it's designed to celebrate him and not intended to provide critical responses or critical views of him. When the Gateway Arch was first built, that's how people were thinking about that project. That's actually a really interesting park in my study area because it has changed while I've been studying it. But it was, the Gateway Arch was celebrating westward expansion and was a commemorative park and an urban renewal project.
Yeah,
Right. So there's and Mount Rushmore, of course, which is also in my area, right? That's commemorating four presidents
very topical.
and also very topical. So on the other side is explanation. So explaining why things happened here. Now, Mount Rushmore, things didn't actually happen there. It's sacred to various indigenous peoples, but nothing happened there per se. Um, People did stop off at Port of St. Louis, so you can say some things happened there, and you can explain why people used it as a jumping off point for the West. But the more interesting things are explaining all the other things. Why did Theodore Roosevelt go west, buy a ranch, a couple of cabins, spend some time out there in western North Dakota, writing, ranching, hunting, and other things that influenced the rest of his life? And why does it matter to America? Right. So there's commemoration, but there's also explanation of what's going on and why.
Why did he go west? I mean, I've got my idea. What's your idea?
The short answer is that his mother and wife died on the same day.
But he had gone west before that happened.
He was already familiar with the West, but he ran far away, and that's what took him out.
Well, I thought part of it also had to do with his brother had been out west and was, this macho guy, and Theodore felt a little. He had some living to do to grow into his boots, and so he wanted to go out west and challenging himself.
That sounds on brand, but I had not heard that story before. I can only say that that story is not told at Theodore Roosevelt National Park.
Well, I think we'll have to set them straight.
Um, and that's interesting too, because there's a wilderness there. Theodore Roosevelt thought of it as a wilderness. We don't often think of the Midwest as being a place of wild spaces, but we do have Midwestern wilderness areas.
A few, a few.
A few. We have three in Illinois, one in Indiana, although it's as big as the three in Illinois put together. Um, one in Missouri comes to mind immediately. None in Iowa. We have them in Wisconsin and Minnesota and elsewhere. So Michigan. So we do have them. It's not like the big Western wildernesses, but they are in fact wild spaces.
Now, the late Richard West Sellers. I don't know if you knew him. He was a long time park historian, a wonderful gentleman that I had the privilege of meeting a couple times. He spoke out about how the Park Service interpreted history. He thought the agency particularly failed when it came time to interpret Native American history, particularly around Fort Laramie and the Fort Laramie treaties. Are you finding any instances where you're questioning whether the Park Service got the interpretation right, or is that not part of your task here?
Yeah, there's a couple. I mean, so at first I'm trying to understand the politics behind the interpretation we get. All right, so what is Congress doing when they want to commemorate somebody and why, right? What are they trying to do when they want the Park Service to be explaining things? And I should say the boundary between those two is fuzzy. But I also, in addition to that, trying to understand how do they get stories wrong, right? And I did know Dick Sellers, and in fact, have him to thank for meeting National Parks Traveler. And it was his Fort Laramie story, and which led to a Fort Laramie story of my own. Um, there were two treaties, as you know, signed at Fort Laramie, and the second one of which was gigantic and actually not at Fort Laramie per se, but down the road.
Right.
And the interesting thing about that fort and many forts is it preserves what remains of a cavalry fort, right? Which is built so it has stables and it has barracks and it has
Sure.
cemeteries and it has other stuff that soldiers would build.
But I'm just hesitating here a little bit because there's also some fur trading
There
history.
is also fur trading history at the first Fort Laramie, true. That Fort Laramie, they don't have any ruins from, but they know about where it was. And then
Right.
you tell the story of that. But think about those two treaties, and in fact, the wars, I mean, soldiers who resupplied at Fort Laramie before heading off, or Western immigrants. But the treaties themselves, you had a huge gathering of peoples from all over the northern plains. And of course, they used teepees. And you have this visual impact of a cavalry fort
Right.
that the visitors see. I mean, they even have the bar where you can get ginger ale, right? And
Yep.
you don't have a great,
Sarsaparilla.
yep, sarsaparilla, thank you. And you don't have a great visual reminder of the teepee, the great gathering of teepees. And there's some reasons for that because there's some native people that don't want the display of empty teepees. But there are other reasons too, which is I just don't think about the Park Service has not thought about how to convey the materiality of things other than the stuff that's there, right? These forts, right? And or reconstructing them, right? At a place like Bent's or at Bent's Old Fort or Grand Portage or places like that where we have reconstructed them.
Right.
But
Right.
there's parts of the story that are not material. They're much more temporary. And there's parts of the story that actually take place a little off-site. And it's hard to think about how to tell off-site stories on-site. right? I mean, you can. I mean, Vicksburg tells the story of the Vicksburg campaign, most of which took place outside Vicksburg, right? So you can tell these stories, but it's often hard to do the things that don't have material remains, and it's really easy to do material remains. And there's lots of people too that like to dress up and be reenactors of fur traders, buckskinners, or reenact military battles or reenact other things. And there's not so many people that want to reenact some of the other things
Because
that you could do, right? I mean, so if you think of the story of slavery in the Southeast, there's just not a huge number of Black Americans that want to reenact slavery.
true,
Right?
true.
So you're just going to end up with different, but there are people who want to reenact the plantation life in beautiful period dresses and whatever else. So there's just some natural things that shape the way, even if you tell both stories perfectly well in signs and museums and exhibits and everything else, the materiality is biased. Objects tell lies.
This is Kurt Repenchek with the National Parks Traveler. We're talking today with Professor Bob Pahre from the University of Illinois, political science professor, about national park interpretation and the politics and how they affect interpretation. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back. Acadia National Park to a young boy was an incredible wonderland, especially to a young boy who grew up in central New Jersey and whose summer vacations typically involved a stay at the seashore for a week or two. Acadia presented me with tree-covered mountains threaded with trails to hike, crashing surf that thundered as it rammed Mount Desert Island, and tidal pools with all sorts of curious marine life. It was my introduction to the national park system, one I've clung hard to for decades. The parks have provided recreation, amazement, and solace, and a break from the tumultuous events that go on around us. Yellowstone, Great Smoky Mountains, Shenandoah, Canyonlands, the list of more than 400 wondrous places in this country provides us with a hopscotch list of destinations that reveal to those who visit magnificent sceneries, rich cultures, and interesting history. With wild seashores at places like Cape Lookout National Seashore, raging rapids that plunge through canyonlands in Grand Canyon National Parks, serpentine underground mazes in Mammoth Caves, towering mountains that hold up the horizons in the Tetons or North Cascades, waves of dunes, Great Sand Dunes National Park and preserves, and thick forests in the Sierra and North Country, I've yet to find a better landscape for adventure. Within Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the Spanish missions of the Southwest, Jackson's death site at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, and Slavin's Roadhouse at Yukon Charlie Rivers National Preserve, just to name 4 destinations, you can come to better understand the country's rich history. Whether you're considering a lifelong journey to visit every unit of the national park system or simply looking for a weekend escape, you can't go wrong in the national park system. For the Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. So, Bob, it's an interesting what you raise about Park Service interpretation, and why is that? Why are there so many missteps, if you want to call them that? Is the Park Service is huge. It goes from American Samoa to Virgin Islands National Park, from Gates of the Arctic down to Big Bend. And even though there's a headquarters in Washington, not all these parks play the same song, it seems. Is that why we don't have a constant, realistic thread of interpretation?
It's certainly true that different regions, or I'm talking here of the historic regions and not the recently reorganized.
Sure.
The Southwest region, of course, had all these great archaeological parks, and so it's natural that they would have strengths in that area. The Southeast has Civil War battlefields, that you don't see on the West Coast or Alaska, obviously.
Yeah.
And so they have expertise in the Civil War and so on. There's different strengths and weaknesses at different places. So there's a little bit of that. Um, there's also just 2011, if I'm remembering the date right, the Organization of American Historians did a nice report on interpretation that emphasized basically the uneven distribution of
Yeah.
professions. That historians were underrepresented and educators were overrepresented, for example. So you have, a professional historian is going to think differently than a professional educator who might move from an interpreter who might move from one part to another and learn, whereas a historian, has written books on that field, on that topic or that park, and is just going to know it in a different way than others might. I think that's some of it too. A cultural anthropologist interested in, say, the culture of the Navajo people over the centuries is going to approach Navajo culture different than an archaeologist will, because the archaeologist has to work with material remains. So even within the field of anthropology and archaeology, you'll get differences in perspectives. I think some of it is that. And some parks are really politicized, always have been.
Yeah, and we'll get into that, but just, the National Park Service is often referred to as the nation's storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
And as you have alluded to, and as I know pretty well, there is a great lack of historians across the National Park Service.
Yes. Yeah, that was in this report. They made that very clear.
Yeah, and I've tried to interview the chief historian about that kind of thing, and they won't let me, or they haven't let me in the past. Maybe I should renew my request. But that is a pitfall, no? I mean, if we're going to look at the National Park Service as the holder of American history, and you can go back to the paleontological record in North America, wouldn't you want to have the very best historical interpretation?
Yeah, so I'll back up a little bit. So before I started doing environmental politics and politics of the national park, I was a Europeanist and spent most of my time in the political history of the 19th century, and I've published some history. And one of my areas of expertise was tariffs and tariff treaties. So yeah, you can imagine it's interesting to watch the news for me. I'll just say that much. Your listeners can purchase one of my books or get them from a library and then learn more about what I think about 19th century tariffs. But so I've spent some time in the 19th century and have nothing but respect for the people who do that full time. The skills you use to write a great narrative of something, though, might not be the skills you use to give a great visitor talk. Writing a great, yeah, right. They can clearly overlap. You're communicating in both cases, but you're communicating in different modes in different ways. So that's the positive way of thinking about the difference. Still, I'd love to have more historians in the parks. I mean, unequivocally, I would love that. I prefer to have more historians in the parks. And I know that in that report and from 2011 and things that I hear from people, people who do have masters or PhDs in history get frustrated that they spend time doing historical reports and looking at historical buildings and documenting damage, or thinking about what can we restore and what we can't restore, or writing up reports related to those sorts of things. And that's not where their narrative skills lie.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. But of course, under the various acts that preserve historic buildings and landmarks and the like, that's something that has to get done. So some of it is a misallocation of the historians that they have too.
Yeah, unfortunately. One of the stories I'd like to bring to the traveler one of these days, and maybe you can help me out here, Bob. Best living history presentations in the national parks. I think that'd be a great story, because I minored in history. I find it interesting to look back and to be able to go into a park and have a living history presentation where it brings that part of history to life. Obviously, the Civil War parks do it all the time. But beyond that, do you ever see redcoats marching in columns at Saratoga National Historical Park?
Have not been there. I've done the revolutionary battlefields of the Carolinas, and I can say no
Yeah,
for the Carolinas. Now, I'm sure you know that there's a long history of a controversy in the National Park Service about living history.
I'm not so sure.
Oh,
Tell us more.
okay. Um, so there have always been people in the Park Service who really like the living history, and more importantly, there have always been um, interest groups and advocates outside the national parks who are really into living history. So it is not uncommon to find a member of Congress who advocates for a particular site, who wants the site reconstructed, and who would love to see the reenactments. It's not unusual to see groups like buckskinners who like to dress up and reenact the fur trade at several of the fur trade posts. On the other hand, there's a lot of national park rangers that think that those reenactments and those living history stories misrepresent the past.
Hmm.
Um,
Why is it?
well, so first of all, I mean, there's a great book on Colonial Williamsburg, not a national park, but adjacent to a national park, that goes through the challenges of that. So, for example, it's hard to reenact slave stories at a place like Colonial Williamsburg. It's also hard to make it actually look like it was. So there was a great debate there about the manure in the streets. And once you raise the question of horse manure in the streets of Williamsburg, you can imagine how two camps would emerge, right?
Sure, sure.
And there's a great book about Fort Snelling in Minneapolis, St. Paul, that also gets at some of these issues. And there's this difficult to handle social situation because you have people who might be playing a part, and yet they're talking to these strangely dressed time travelers. And there's just no way that can be realistic, right?
Yeah, I don't know. We had a story earlier this year from Minuteman National Historical Site or Historical Park, and the reenactment that they did there. Ken Burns is coming out with his Revolutionary War
Mm-hmm.
film, a documentary. I can't wait to see it. I saw a preview the other night on PBS, and they seem to reenact things pretty well.
I have not seen their reenactment, so I can't vouch.
Yeah,
But and there are ways. So you could have costume reenactors who don't act in character, but just convey. And if you have enough of them, they might convey a sense of a site.
yeah, yeah.
One of my own personal what ifs about this kind of issue is Civil War battlefields. There's lots and lots and lots of silent cannons,
Yeah.
right? And if you, the interesting thing about those cannons, those batteries were interspersed with infantry and cavalry. And if you think about the density, and sometimes the signs will give you a sense of, oh, this regiment was here, this regiment was here, and so forth. And you go, egads, then the people crammed together around these silent cannons
Yeah.
would have been much out of proportion to the actual cannons themselves. And so it conveys a commemorative purpose, right? You're commemorating people who fought here, and you're using an artillery piece to commemorate a battle, but you're not coming anywhere near conveying a sense of what that battle was like if you had been there
True. True.
working a gun, right?
I mean, it,
I should say, it's too bad that we no longer have Bob Utley with us because he actually was on both sides of this debate at different times.
yeah. Former Park Service historian.
Yeah, and he mentions it in some of his books, and there's an oral history in which he also discusses that. So, if you can use generated artificial intelligence to reconstruct Bob Utley speaking about his reenactments, would be an interesting use of technology.
Yeah, yeah. Let's not go down the AI road. No, it's just, I guess it's disappointing that we have this uneven interpretation of history across the park system.
Yeah, and I would say it definitely is. And there was a time when I was writing this book when I tried to think systematically about that unevenness in terms of biases. Right. So there's a bias towards the stories that have material objects with them and away from the stories that don't have material objects with them. That's a pretty straightforward one. There's among the social sciences, so I think historians are way underrepresented compared to where they should be.
Yeah.
But good luck finding an economist or a political scientist or a sociologist in the national parks.
Or an archaeologist or a paleontologist or a landscape architect or volcanologist.
Yeah, those all exist, right?
In places. They're all in visitor centers right now.
Yeah, yeah. And yet I can think of stories where, for example, St. Louis and New Orleans, these were among the largest cities of the United States back in the day, top 5 cities in size. And they were important for their economics. And that was a period in which economic historians have been really interested, the early 2/3 of the 19th century. What would happen if you got some economic historians to help you work up those histories? And I realize that economic historians like to throw around a lot of statistics and economic modeling, and I've done it myself, but there are stories there that just are not getting caught, not getting picked up because you don't have those kinds of professionals.
True.
Political scientists, it's not my kind of political scientist, but the people who do voting behavior have been talking about identity politics and polarization since the 50s. And they have thoughts about how the current period contrasts with, say, the 1850s. Most of them will say something along the lines of, "You ain't seen nothing yet." Right. But I can imagine Civil War stories that might be enriched or that you might provoke visitors to think about political polarization by comparing a Civil War story with today. Now, I realize that's going to be politically fraught for any ranger involved with such a story.
Sure.
But I can imagine, too, that interpretation is about making personal connections with the visitor. And as Freeman Tilden said, and so I can imagine something along those lines might engage some people.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you mentioned a while ago Sand Creek Massacre site and how the enabling legislation specifically focused on some of the interpretation, I believe, that was supposed to be provided.
The enabling of legislation, I don't want to overstate it, but essentially the Cheyenne and Arapaho were always going to have a voice and a voice that was going to be heard. That doesn't mean that they get to direct things or control things, but that means that this is commemorating a massacre of the Southern Cheyenne and Southern Arapaho, and that they should have important influence over the stories.
Mm-hmm.
And one visit, if you've been there, hard to get to, by the way, but if you've been there, one way that you'll see this is there's a trail that goes up to a bluff above Sand Creek, and below the bluff is sacred ground. And so people who are not Cheyenne and Arapaho do not go there, right? Cannot go there. And that's something that you can imagine a non-Indigenous person like me might be interested in seeing something of what happened down there. But I don't get to do that, and I'm okay that I don't get to do that.
Yeah, yeah. But, current events, we've seen, and this should be fascinating for your book, we've seen the Trump administration, at least reportedly, force the Park Service to take down certain exhibits. The most famous one is the removal of the scourged back portrait of a formerly enslaved man whose back was just riddled with scars from the beatings he took. He managed to escape, and he actually joined the Northern Army, the Union Army, during the Civil War. And some would have it that maybe in the enabling legislation of Harper's Ferry, a law tells the Park Service to provide that type of interpretation. And so the administration is breaking the law, perhaps by removing some interpretive materials that it thinks disparages Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to say first, outside my study area, I mean, I haven't read the enabling legislation of Harper's Ferry. 50 parks is too many to begin with. But it is certainly true that there's enabling legislation that does privilege particular stories, right? The civil rights stories, the Selma and Montgomery National Historical Trail, or trails associated with Martin Luther King. I'm sorry, sites associated with Martin Luther King. Of course, they give priority to the civil rights story of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And one of the big challenges which Trump 47 is making visible is this is a place where commemoration and explanation get mixed up. If you say there's a no disparagement idea in the executive order, well, Martin Luther King was campaigning against people. To understand Martin Luther King, to explain him, you have to talk about what those other people thought. And it's going to be disparaging by the nature of the beast, right? If you're commemorating Martin Luther King because he accomplished something, then his opponents must have been in error in some way. Not in always, right? I mean, I don't want to say that. But if you commemorate one side and explain why Martin Luther King is important, you do then have to talk about his political opponents in some way. All right.
Sure.
And if you want to clean up and just say anything we say about those political opponents will not look good, so we're not going to talk about it, then you're not doing what you need to do.
When you're talking about politics and national park interpretation, have you come across any other administrations previous to the current one that had such an influence on park interpretation?
So there's a reason why I said Trump 47. So if you think in terms of commemoration and explanation, it is certainly true that different administrations and different directors of the Park Service and different park rangers have thought about that balance in lots of different ways over the years. And it is also true, Trump 45, actually, I think fit within that broad scope of debates between commemoration and explanation. His administration clearly preferred commemoration and wanted to emphasize commemoration as opposed to explanation. And so was more strongly in that direction than most other presidential administrations. But I think I can fit him within that approach to the book. I am, for the time being, not writing anything about Trump 47 because I don't know yet whether it will fit into the existing broad sweep back and forth between administrations or whether it will look like something different. I mean, we're only 8 months in. We have had battles over the depiction of slavery before, for example. So that is within the sweep of presidential administrations from 1916 to today.
And you have to wonder where it's going to stop. I mean, the biggest story was the one out of Harper's Ferry in Fort Pulaski with the supposed removal of enslaved history interpretation. I say supposed. There was an interesting congressional hearing recently where an associate director of the Park Service could neither confirm nor deny that the items had been removed. And you would think that the top of the National Park Service would know whether that actually happened. But then there was another report that a climate change placard was taken down at Acadia National Park. And certainly, if you move west across the country, you've got, Japanese American internment site, incarceration sites like Minidoga and Manzanar that have horrible stories about how Japanese Americans were treated. Important stories, but in the eyes of the administration, they might say, no, those are horrible, we're going to take them down. Can you effectively alter history in that fashion?
Well, of course, people do, and we have stories from around the world of people of governments rewriting history or only featuring part of history and so forth. But the internment camps are a great example. You cannot commemorate, remember the people who suffered there or commemorate the things that they went through without saying something disparaging about the people who put them there. If you're going to explain why you're commemorating someone, and of course, people want to know. They get to a place. This summer, I happened to go to Grant Coors, which commemorates cowboys and a cattle baron, and people, want to know what's so important about Conrad Coors, the cattle baron, and of course, the site has answers, right?
He had a big ranch.
People want to know, why are we commemorating this? And so you have to have an answer. And the answer in some places, like the internment camps, is going to have to say negative things about some other people.
Yeah.
Right. And there's lots of places, I should say, where sometimes I'm impressed in a good way with the even-sided of the national parks, even-sidedness. So these Revolutionary War sites that I visited in the Carolinas, only because my son went to college down there. Of course, the patriots are the people who won. They're the ones who, seceded from the United States, from the United Kingdom, and created the United States of America. And there were Americans who opposed them, who are called loyalists.
Or Tories.
The Tories, you will also see them referred to as Tories, but the sites I visited, you preferred the word loyalists. And you, of course, will also see redcoats at most of those sites in very large numbers or small. And of course, they were our opponents. They were the opponents of the patriots. And the Park Service maintains memorials to each of those three groups and treats each of them seriously and respectfully. At Palo Alto, on the right near the Mexican border in Texas, a battlefield of the Mexican-American War, the Park Service consulted with Mexican historians to treat both sides fairly and respectfully. The Civil War sites, of course, treat Confederates and Unions equally, in the sense that they don't go around insulting either side, right? And they are honoring the sacrifices of both. And that has not always been true of the battles against indigenous people on the frontier, although there has been a steady movement towards that, right? And Little Bighorn is the classic case where it was an entirely Custer story for a long time, but you will now learn more about both sides. I would not say it's 50-50 yet, but you'll see that in other sites too. So in all those cases, the Park Service is trying to be fair-minded and the like when explaining what's going on and not disparaging people. And but I think in some places, Sand Creek Massacre, Chivington massacred the allies of the United States. It's not a nice way to sugarcoat that, right? And he went through 3 separate investigations, and was found guilty of misdeeds in all 3. He was never punished for various legal technicalities associated with the end of the Civil War. Right. And so I don't know how you tell a massacre story and honor the people who were allies of the United States who were massacred without saying that he and most of his men were doing this contrary to law and were found to be such. There were 2 troops who refused to participate, and the park does tell that story too.
Yeah, yeah. We're running out of time, and I know you're approaching this as a political scientist, a historian, perhaps. How does America, if this purging of content from the national parks continues, how do you push back against that?
Um, my rule of thumb is we should just be telling more stories. And that sounds kind of strange, right? But there's just a lot of stories associated with all of these stories. And to give an example that seems to be on nobody's radar, on the Mormon Pioneer National Historic Trail from Nauvoo, Illinois, actually Carthage, Illinois, to Salt Lake City, we tell the story of the Mormons who, under Brigham Young, moved westward and established the state of Utah, and um, and established their religion and thrived out there. Well, there was a large number of people of Mormons who chose not to do that, including most of Brigham Young's family, his wife, kids, and others. And that church, once known as the Restored Church of Latter-day Saints, has a different name now and is in Independence, Missouri. But it's still around, and they actually own some of the land in Nauvoo where they tell their story, as does the Utah Church, which also tells its story there. And my view is we should be telling all these stories. All right. And the more of these stories, and then people can think about what's going on here. What do I think about this story since I'm hearing it from a couple of different angles now?
Sure, sure. But if the Park Service is not allowed to tell those stories,
Then we've got to then I think nonprofits have probably got to set up. You got to make sure that the stories are in the bookstores. People are buying fewer and fewer books in bookstores. If you go to a bookstore over time, as I have, you'll see more and more, I don't want to say toys, but let's say more and more thematic collectibles that have some connection to the resources, which they're required to have. But people are less likely to buy a 500-page history of the Sand Creek Massacre than they might have been in the past. And people are going to have to get these stories outside the parks until the pendulum swings and another administration restores it all.
We will see if that happens. That's Professor Robert Pahre from the University of Illinois, a political science professor who is writing a book on the politics of national park interpretation. Bob, it's been great to have you today. I can't wait for your book to come out.
I can't wait for my book to get written. So thank you very much, Kurt. It's been great to be here.
Thank you. That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. Whether the Trump administration takes further steps to control the interpretation of American history by the National Park Service is something we'll be tracking and seeking answers to. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.